Monty Python's Life of Brian is not merely a comedic retelling of historical events, but a rich, satirical exploration of human psychology and the unconscious mind. At first glance, it appears to be a parody of religious figures, historical myths, and political movements. But through the lens of Jungian psychology, it becomes a profound commentary on the individual's search for identity amidst societal projections, the tension between the conscious ego and the unconscious self, and the process of self-realization. Brian Cohen, born on the same day as Jesus Christ, is caught in the crossfire of divine expectations and the absurdity of human belief systems. Through Brian's journey, we see a vivid exploration of the process of individuation, the Jungian concept of integrating the unconscious with the conscious self, embracing all aspects of the psyche, and reconciling contradictions within the self and the world. That Brian's story is a tragicomic allegory for the human condition. From the moment of his birth in a stable next to Jesus, Brian is tied to a narrative of divine purpose that he never asked for. He is, in a sense, a mirror for every individual who is shaped by the expectations and roles imposed upon them by others, be it family, society, or the collective unconscious. Brian's persona, the outward mask that he is forced to wear, is not one of his choosing. It is a role imposed by others, a role that, like the persona, masks the true self. Brian's attempts to escape the weight of this role, to reject the false identity as the Messiah, are symbolic of the universal struggle to reconcile who we are with who others think we should be. His rejection of the role thrust upon him mirrors the Jungian process of confronting the persona and seeking to uncover the authentic self beneath the projections of the world. That Brian's ego, which represents the conscious mind, is in constant conflict with the unconscious projections placed upon him by the world. His shadow, the darker, repressed parts of the psyche, constantly haunts him as the expectations of those around him grow increasingly absurd. The zealots, the resistance movement that mistakes Brian for a divine figure, are symbolic of the collective unconscious. These followers, desperate for a Messiah, project their collective need for a savior onto Brian. Their beliefs are not based on reality or the truth of Brian's being, but on the unconscious need for a figure to give their lives meaning. Jung believed that much of the collective unconscious was filled with archetypes, deep, universal symbols that transcend time and culture. And here, the archetype of the savior is projected onto Brian, creating a situation where his identity becomes less about his authentic self and more about what others want him to be. The projection of the Messiah archetype onto Brian is a satirical commentary on the power of collective belief and the ways in which individuals are often shaped by external forces. Throughout the film, Brian becomes the focus of unconscious projections that limit his ability to be himself. His ego constantly battles these projections, but as is often the case, the unconscious is not so easily controlled. The zealots, who worship Brian not because of his qualities, but because of their unconscious need for a messianic figure, symbolize how the unconscious forces of society project meaning and purpose onto individuals. These projections reflect the human tendency to externalize our own desires for salvation, relying on figures of authority and divinity to give our lives a sense of direction and purpose, instead of engaging with the complexities of the unconscious. Self.at the heart of the film is the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we reject or refuse to acknowledge. Brian's struggle is not just external, with the forces that try to make him a messiah. It is also internal, as he grapples with the shadow of society's expectations and his own desire to live authentically. The shadow in Jungian terms is not inherently negative. It contains both the repressed aspects of the self, including untapped potential and unrealized desires, and also the darker impulses that are difficult to confront. For Brian, the shadow manifests in the form of the roles forced upon him by the external world. His repeated protests against being called the Messiah are symbolic of the ego's rejection of the unconscious, the parts of himself that are projected onto him by the masses. This constant conflict between the ego, Brian's conscious identity, and the shadow, the unconscious projections, is at the heart of his personal struggle. The character of Reg, the leader of the People's Front of Judea, represents the archetype of the revolutionary, driven by the need for ideological purity and political change. Reg's character is caught up in the same shadow dynamics as Brian. He cannot see beyond his own obsessive desire for revolution and fails to understand the absurdity of his political movements. His constant struggle with the division within. His group, obsessed with factional purity, mirrors the unconscious fragmentation of the psyche. The political factions in the film, which constantly bicker and fight over trivial ideological differences, are a satire on the self-destructive nature of extreme ideologies and the inability to unite the various aspects of the self or the world. In a Jungian sense, Reg and his followers symbolize the unintegrated aspects of the collective unconscious, constantly in conflict, unable to find unity and cohesion because of their own internal contradictions. Bigus Dicus, the clumsy Roman noble, represents the archetype of the fool, who is oblivious to the deeper truths of the world. Bigus Dicus's humorous interactions with Pontius Pilate represent the ego's relationship with authority, which is often blind to its own flaws and contradictions. The absurdity of Bigus Dicus's situation, caught between power, privilege, and personal confusion, illustrates how the ego is often detached from the deeper, more complex forces of the unconscious. His relationship with Pilate, who is in charge of executing Brian, points to the unconscious dissonance between authority figures and the absurdity of their actions. Bigus Dicus's foolishness serves as a satirical commentary on the ridiculousness of power structures, revealing how even the most powerful figures in society are caught in the absurd webs of their own unconscious minds. The heart of the film is Brian's search for identity. Throughout his journey, he is constantly mistaken for someone else, often as the Messiah, a figure of externalized salvation that he never wanted to embody. The film is a psychological exploration of the self and the struggle for authentic identity. Amidst external projections, in the final moments, when Brian is crucified and sings, "Always look on the bright side of life," he experiences a moment of self-realization. This final act is symbolic of the integration of the shadow, where Brian accepts the absurdity of his life and, in doing so, achieves a kind of peace and wholeness. His acceptance of his fate, even as he faces death, mirrors the Jungian concept of embracing both the light and dark aspects of life. This act of embracing life's absurdity is a form of psychological transcendence, where Brian accepts both his false messiah identity and his true self, embracing the contradictions of life and death. The crucifixion scene represents the ultimate surrender to life's contradictions. Through his willingness to die with a song on his lips, Brian embraces the paradoxes of existence, life and death, joy and suffering, meaning and absurdity. In Jungian terms, this is the reconciliation of opposites, a moment when the ego surrenders to the totality of existence, integrating the conscious and unconscious forces into a unified whole. Brian's journey, while filled with absurdity and misunderstandings, ultimately leads to his individuation, the process by which he transcends his external projections and becomes one with his true self. In conclusion, Life of Brian is not just a brilliant satirical comedy about religion and politics. It is a profound psychological journey that explores the Jungian process of individuation, the integration of the shadow, and the struggle for authentic identity in a world that constantly projects expectations and false roles onto the individual. Through Brian's journey, we are reminded of the absurdity of life, the dangers of blind faith, and the importance of embracing all parts of the self, the light and the dark, the absurd and the profound, on the path towards self-realization.